Her chest tightened before she knew why. The room was quiet, the lights dim, and still she felt that old familiar panic rise, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. On the outside she looked calm, composed, even radiant in her poise. But beneath the polished exterior lived a younger self, still frozen in the moment she first learned that love could abandon, that safety could collapse without warning. She had buried that girl so deep she convinced herself she was gone. Yet the shadow has no mercy for denial. It waits, patient, feeding in silence until it breaks through in sudden shame, a trembling hand, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. This may hurt, but it's true. What she thought was strength was often just survival dressed in elegance. She had learned to perform wholeness, to wear competence as a mask so convincing that even she began to believe it. But when night came, when the world quieted and there were no mirrors to reassure her, she felt the fracture inside. The wound was invisible, but it bled every day in small betrayals, settling for love that diminished her, silencing herself to keep peace, confusing sacrifice with devotion. She thought she was choosing love. In truth, she was choosing her shadow. The shadow, Jung said, is not evil in itself. It is the collection of everything we reject, everything we deny, everything we were once told was too much or not enough. For her, the shadow carried the rage she swallowed as a child, the grief she never allowed herself to cry, the wild hunger for freedom that was shamed into silence. She built her identity on what was acceptable, and so the rest of her, raw, untamed, vulnerable, lived in the basement of her psyche. Every smile she gave was shadowproof, but every night she wept in ways she couldn't name. You know that feeling, don't you? When the body betrays what the mouth insists is fine. The throat tightens when you need to speak. The chest hardens when you want to cry. The body remembers the truth, even when the mind refuses it. And in those moments, the shadow rules, not through conscious choice, but through instinct, through the old survival programs etched into muscle and bone. That is why she could not stop choosing partners who resembled her first wound, why she confused being needed with being loved, why the more she tried to be whole, the more empty she felt. It is a cruel paradox. Trauma teaches us to survive by becoming what others demand, but healing requires us to undo that performance. To look into the mirror and admit, this mask has protected me, but it has also imprisoned me. The woman she presented to the world was capable, responsible, admirable, but the girl inside her was still waiting for someone to notice the trembling. And until she turned toward that girl, no amount of external validation could fill the hollow inside. Imagine her standing at a dinner table, laughter surrounding her, wine glasses glinting. She is smiling, nodding, radiant. Yet under the table, her fists are clenched so tight her nails dig into her skin. That is shadow, the dissonance between the outer stage and the inner truth. And every time she ignored it, the shadow grew darker, hungrier, whispering into her choices, leading her back into pain disguised as love. But here is the secret few dare to speak. The shadow does not vanish when ignored. It multiplies. It manifests in jealousy, in sabotage, in sudden rage at the ones we claim to love. It seeps into the voice that tells us we are never enough, or too much, or always one step away from being abandoned again. And though she pretended she was above it, her shadow ruled her life in silence. Heavy, isn't it? To realize that the very thing she thought she escaped was the very thing directing her choices. Yet there is a strange kind of hope here. Because once the shadow is seen, it can no longer rule invisibly. Once the wound is acknowledged, it can finally be tended. And once she dares to look at the trembling girl she buried inside, she will find not just pain, but power. The raw, unbroken energy of her own truth waiting to be reclaimed. The question is, what happens when the mask begins to crack? When the body refuses to play along? When the shadow rises to the surface and demands to be known? At first, the cracks were small. A sudden tear at a movie scene that didn't warrant such grief. A flash of rage at a minor slight, so disproportionate it startled even her. A numbness in bed with someone she swore she loved. She brushed them off, telling herself it was stress, hormones, exhaustion. But the truth was more unsettling. The shadow was no longer content to stay buried. It wanted her attention. It wanted her honesty. And like a child throwing a tantrum, it would not stop until it was seen. She had built her life like a porcelain vase, polished, flawless, admired by many. But porcelain, for all its beauty, is fragile, and when the first fracture ran through her, she panicked. She thought healing meant repairing the vase, gluing the shards back together until no one could see the damage. But individuation, Jung taught, is not about repairing perfection. It is about becoming real, whole, not because the cracks are hidden, but because they are honored. You feel that, don't you? The way life forces us into the confrontation we avoid. The moment we can no longer pretend the mask is enough. For her, it came during a breakup, not her first, but the one that stripped her illusion bare. He told her she was too much and never enough in the same breath. Words she had heard before, words that echoed an old script from childhood. And in that moment, she collapsed onto the bathroom floor, shaking, her chest heavy, her breath shallow. It wasn't just his rejection she was mourning. It was the wound resurfacing, demanding to be faced. That night she saw the shadow not as an enemy but as a mirror. Every choice she made to silence herself, every moment she settled for less, every instance of pretending she was fine, it was all the shadow playing its part. And the shadow's role is simple: to carry the pain until the conscious self is ready to hold it. What she had mistaken as weakness was actually her own strength, her psyche's way of protecting her until she was ready to remember. But remembering is not painless. The body resists. The mind fights back. The inner critic screams louder, desperate to maintain control. Healing is not a gentle ascent. It is a confrontation, a wrestling match with the unseen. She began journaling, and what poured onto the page frightened her. The rage, the grief, the confessions of how unloved she felt, how unworthy she believed she was. Her hand trembled as if betraying a secret too dangerous to reveal. Yet with every word, the trembling steadied, as though the child within her finally had a voice. Here is the paradox you must face. The parts of yourself you fear will make you unlovable are the very parts that will free you. She learned that the tears she once swallowed could cleanse. The rage she buried could protect. The longing she suppressed could guide her back to her true desires. The shadow was not her enemy. It was her teacher. And every lesson came wrapped in discomfort, demanding she sit still in the fire without running away. Imagine her at her therapist's office, the silence stretching long. She feels the urge to fill it with polite words, but instead she lets the silence sit. Her throat tightens, her chest burns, and then the sob erupts. It is raw, guttural, not pretty at all. She hates it, fears it, but something inside her softens after. That is shadow work, not glamorous, not polished, but necessary. To descend into the wound is the only way to reclaim the pieces she left behind. And yet, descent is only the beginning. To face the shadow is to unlock a new kind of responsibility. Because once she knows the truth of her wound, she can no longer choose ignorance. She must now decide, will she keep betraying herself to feel safe, or will she risk stepping into the unknown, where love does not require performance? The cracks in the vase were no longer flaws to be hidden. They became invitations. But every invitation asks a cost. Was she willing to lose the comfort of being admired to gain the liberation of being known? She didn't answer that question right away. Most don't. The comfort of the familiar, even when it's suffocating, feels safer than the uncertainty of freedom. So she lingered in the in-between, half awake, half asleep. One day lighting candles, reading about healing, scribbling in journals with trembling hands. The next, retreating into old patterns, texting men who mirrored her wound, smiling at parties where her laughter tasted of ash. This is the rhythm of transformation, the dance between the old self and the emerging one. Her shadow tested her at every turn. When she set a boundary, the voice whispered, "They'll leave you." When she asked for what she needed, it hissed, "You're too demanding." When she dared to rest, it sneered, "You're lazy, worthless." These were not new voices. They were ancient, echoing from childhood moments when her needs were inconvenient, when her emotions were punished, when her small hands reached for comfort and found only cold silence. Each voice was the ghost of a memory, still haunting her as though time had not passed. And yet something was shifting. She began to notice the difference between the shadow's voice and her own. At first it was subtle, a pause before reacting, a breath before collapsing. A question whispered in her mind, what if this voice is not the truth but the wound speaking? That pause became her first taste of freedom, because the shadow loses its grip the moment you see it for what it is. The trap only works in the dark. You know this feeling, don't you? That flicker of awareness when you realize the panic, the shame, the endless self-doubt. It doesn't belong to the woman you are today. It belongs to the child who had no choice but to believe it. And when you see that, even for a moment, you can begin to separate. You can begin to say, this is pain, but this is not me. Descent grew deeper. Dreams surfaced, strange, symbolic, filled with images she didn't understand but felt in her body. A black snake curling at her feet, a locked room in a burning house, a child's voice calling from the basement. Jung would call this the language of the unconscious, the psyche speaking in symbols. She began writing them down, sitting with them, noticing how they mirrored her waking life. The snake was fear, yes, but also transformation. The locked room was her silence, but also her potential. The child's voice was her own, still waiting to be heard. The confrontation with the shadow is never linear. Some nights she felt alive, awake, more herself than ever before. Other nights she crumbled into the same old despair, convinced she would never be free. But each time she broke, she learned to stay with herself a little longer. She stopped abandoning the trembling girl inside. And slowly the girl began to trust her. Slowly the frozen parts thawed. Slowly the shadow softened. Imagine her at home one evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor. No makeup, no audience, no mask. She places her hand over her heart and whispers, "I'm here, I won't leave you again." Tears spill down her cheeks, but this time they don't feel like weakness. They feel like return. For the first time, she is mothering herself, offering the love she once begged for but never received. And in that moment, the shadow shifts from enemy to ally, from prison to pathway. But awareness alone is not enough. To truly heal, she must embody it. To live differently, not just think differently. To stand in front of the mirror and say no when her body wants to collapse into yes. To risk disappointing others in order to remain true to herself. To stop looking for love in places that feed her wound and instead create love from the inside out. Each choice is small, almost invisible, but each choice builds a new pattern, a new reality. Still, the cost remains, because every step toward wholeness is a step away from the life she built on half-truths. Friends may drift, lovers may leave, family may not understand, and the temptation to return to old performances grows strong. But she now knows the truth. Every time she betrays herself to stay safe, the shadow takes over again, and she has come too far to surrender. The question lingers in her chest. Will she keep dimming her light to avoid being alone, or will she risk shining so brightly that only those who can meet her there remain? The nights grew quieter but not easier. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the war between two selves. One, the obedient daughter who kept the peace by silencing her needs. The other, the woman rising within her, refusing to bow to that silence anymore. The tension between them was unbearable at times, like being torn apart from the inside. Yet this tearing was not destruction. It was birth. Individuation is never a gentle unfolding. It is the violent breaking of old skin, the cracking of a shell that no longer fits. Her body carried the evidence. Some mornings her shoulders ached as if she had carried the weight of centuries. Her throat burned when she swallowed words instead of speaking them. Her stomach twisted whenever she betrayed her own boundaries to avoid conflict. The body does not lie. It remembers every betrayal, every abandonment, every unspoken truth. And the body demands release. Through tears, through shaking, through the trembling hands she once thought were weakness but now recognized as sacred signals. Here lies your shadow. Here waits your freedom. Heavy, isn't it? The realization that healing means feeling everything you once avoided, the rage, the grief, the terror of being unloved. She resisted, of course. Every woman does at first. She tried to meditate it away, journal it away, rationalize it away. But the shadow cannot be bypassed. It does not yield to cleverness. It yields only to presence, the courage to stay with the wound without running. And so she stayed. In one pivotal moment, she sat in her car after another painful conversation, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Every nerve screamed at her to drive to the familiar, the man who diminished her, the friends who applauded her mask, the routines that numbed her out. But she didn't. She sat. She shook. She cried so hard her body convulsed. And then she whispered, barely audible, "I choose me." Those 3 words changed everything. Not instantly, not magically, but like a stone dropped in water, the ripples spread through her life. She began to notice how often she had betrayed herself, how often she had swallowed her no, how often she had begged for love that starved her, and with each noticing came another choice. Some she got right. Some she didn't, but the seed was planted. Self-betrayal was no longer love. It was poison. You feel that shift, don't you? The moment when the old script loses its hold, when the body refuses to collapse into what is familiar, when the soul whispers that something else is possible, even if you cannot see it yet. This is the crossing point, the place where many turn back, because stepping forward feels like walking into fire. But fire is the only way through. In dreams, she began to see the symbols return but transformed. The black snake, once terrifying, now shedding its skin before her eyes. The locked room, once suffocating, now opening to reveal a garden. The child's voice, once crying from the basement, now standing before her, reaching out with open hands. These were not just dreams. They were her psyche showing her that the shadow, when faced, becomes a guide. The integration was not glamorous. It looked like saying no to men who wanted her body but not her soul. It looked like disappointing friends who preferred her silence. It looked like nights alone, where loneliness pressed heavy on her chest, and she had to remind herself that solitude is not the same as abandonment. Each choice burned, but each choice built her strength. The world began to notice, though subtly, a different energy in her presence, a weight in her voice that wasn't there before. She no longer needed to prove or perform. She no longer sought approval in every glance. And though the shadow still whispered at times, its voice grew fainter, less convincing, like an echo fading with distance. Still, the greatest test remained, because healing is never only about the self. It is about how you return to the world, how you love again, how you work, how you create, how you stand in the face of life's demands without shrinking. And she knew her shadow would rise again in these places. The question was, would she meet it this time not with fear but with recognition? She knew the test would come in love, because love had always been the battlefield where her shadow ruled most fiercely. In the past, she had mistaken intensity for intimacy, sacrifice for devotion, chaos for passion. Each relationship replayed the same script. She gave too much, they gave too little, and she convinced herself that enduring the starvation was proof of loyalty. But shadow-driven love is not love. It is reenactment, the unconscious dragging the past into the present. So when someone new appeared, she felt the old pattern stir. Her chest tightened. Her mind raced with strategies, how to be appealing, how not to scare him off, how to fold herself into the shape of his desires. For a moment she almost followed the script again, but then she caught herself. She felt the shadow tugging, whispering its familiar lines, and instead of obeying, she paused. She placed her hand on her heart, grounding into her body. The trembling girl inside whispered, "Don't leave me this time." That pause changed everything. She spoke honestly instead of performing. She admitted her fears instead of hiding them. She allowed her boundaries to stand even when it risked rejection. And though it terrified her, she discovered something radical. The world did not end when she chose herself. In fact, the more she honored her truth, the clearer it became who could truly meet her and who could not. For the first time, she was not desperate to be chosen, she was choosing. This is what individuation looks like. Not perfection, not the absence of fear, but the courage to remain whole even in the presence of love. The shadow no longer controlled her in secret. It stood beside her as a reminder of where she had been, and as a guardian of where she refused to return. Every relationship became a mirror, not of her brokenness, but of her wholeness. And though some connections fell away, the ones that remained were rooted in truth. You see, the shadow is not the enemy of love. It is its protector. It ensures that the love you now choose is not the repetition of old wounds, but the expansion of new possibility. It demands that you never again sacrifice your soul just to avoid being alone. And in honoring it, you finally meet love not as a child begging, but as a woman standing whole. Her work did not stop there. Individuation demanded that she bring her wholeness into every corner of life. Into her work, where she once overgave to prove her worth, she now created from alignment instead of depletion. Into her friendships, where she once played the role of caretaker, she now allowed reciprocity. Into her family, where old dynamics pulled at her like chains, she began to hold firm, no longer collapsing into the role assigned to her. Each arena tested her resolve. Each demanded she choose truth over comfort. And still the shadow returned, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in sudden waves of shame, sometimes in the impulse to shrink. But now, instead of fearing it, she recognized its voice. She wowed. Place a hand on her body, breathe deeply, and say, "I see you, I hear you, but I no longer need you to protect me this way." And slowly, the shadow transformed, from a tyrant into a companion, from a saboteur into a guide. This is the paradox that heals. The very part of her she once rejected became the key to her freedom. By descending into the darkness, she unearthed her light. By facing her trembling, she reclaimed her power. By daring to stop betraying herself, she became whole. And yet one question lingered, haunting and luminous. If wholeness is possible, what does it demand of us in every moment we live? It demanded that she live without armor. That was the hardest part. Armor had been her survival, perfection, competence, pleasing, silence. Without it, she felt exposed, as if the world could see every scar, every tender place she once hid. Vulnerability is terrifying when all you've known is rejection. And yet, it is also the only doorway to authenticity. To walk without armor meant risking judgment, losing admiration, facing misunderstanding. But it also meant breathing freely for the first time, unchained by performance. She began to notice how her body responded when she chose differently. When she said yes to herself and no to another, her shoulders dropped. When she allowed tears to fall in front of someone safe, her chest loosened. When she dared to express desire without shame, her voice grew stronger, fuller. The body that once carried only survival now carried aliveness. It was as if every cell whispered, "Finally, you are with us. Finally, you are home." And yet the shadow still tested her, now in subtler ways. In the quiet moments, the old whispers tried to creep back. "You're too much. You'll end up alone. Who do you think you are to live like this?" They no longer roared, they hissed, like embers fading but not yet gone. Healing, she realized, was not a finish line. It was devotion. a daily choosing, a lifelong dance between shadow and light. You know this, don't you? That moment when you think you've healed, only for an old trigger to rise again. It can feel like failure, but it is. It's life asking, will you abandon yourself this time or will you stay? Each return of the shadow is not regression, but invitation to embody the truth more deeply, to anchor more fully into wholeness. In time, she began to see beauty in what she once despised. The cracks in her porcelain were not flaws, but rivers of gold, like the Japanese art of kintsugi. The trembling of her hands was not weakness, but signal. The depth of her grief was not burden, but proof of her capacity to love. She stopped trying to erase the shadow and instead allowed it to paint her in shades both dark and luminous. She was no longer one thing or the other, she was both, and that made her whole. Her relationships shifted again, but this time not through loss, but through transformation. Those who could not meet her truth drifted naturally without war. Those who remained learned to stand with her in her fullness, no longer demanding the smaller version of her. And when new love arrived, she did not collapse into it. She stood, rooted, open yet unyielding. Love was no longer a wound to repeat, but a gift to share. Still, individuation is not only about love or healing. It is about becoming who you were always meant to be. For her, this meant using her voice in ways she once feared, speaking truths that shook the room, creating work that carried her essence, not just her skill, living days shaped not by obligation but by alignment. And with every choice, the shadow softened because it no longer needed to scream for her attention. She was living what it had always demanded: authenticity. The woman who once collapsed into silence now stood with a grounded presence that could not be faked. The girl inside her was no longer trembling in the basement. She was walking beside her, integrated, whole. And though the shadow still lingered at times, it no longer ruled. It had become a reminder, a compass, a keeper of her truth. One day she stood before the mirror and felt no urge to adjust, no need to perform. She simply looked and saw not fragments, not masks, not wounds, but a whole woman staring back. It was not perfection. It was power. The quiet, undeniable power of someone who has faced the shadow and chosen to live. And perhaps that is where the true ascent begins, not in escaping the shadow, but in carrying it with grace. Not in erasing the past, but in honoring it as the soil from which you grew. So the question now is not whether she is whole. The question is, how will she live now that nothing within her is in exile?